Hello and welcome to episode 365 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, we're back. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm back and refreshed. We had a nice break over the Easter period. I think we all felt like we needed a bit of a break after the crazy first quarter of 2022, because it's always the busiest time for us on Money to the Masses and anybody who works in finance, actually. So it was nice to have some time to spend with the family, but we're back now, raring to go. And actually, I just need to mention, there wasn't a midweek markets podcast this week that people may have noticed. And as part of what we're doing at Money to the Masses at the moment, we've just got through the crazy period and we're now looking at some of the stuff that we do, the content we create, and reviewing it. So at the moment, midweek markets is going to have a bit of a holiday. We're going to pause it and then reflect on all the content that we do. The good news is this podcast won't be changing. So this Sunday show is going to remain the same, but we're looking at all the stuff we do across the breadth of the Money to the Masses platform. That includes things on the site, etc. So we'll keep you updated on that.
And actually, like Damien said, it's been paused at the moment while we look at other things, but we're kind of open for ideas, because we're not saying that there's not going to be another podcast on this channel. So if there's stuff that you particularly as listeners think that we should be covering or doing, then do get in touch, because it'll be interesting to know, because at the end of the day, we do this for you guys, the listeners. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, and to give you a potential idea there, we are conscious of the cost of living crisis that's happening, and from my view of where things that I see going, I think we're going to be with this cost of living crisis for the foreseeable future. I mean, into 2023 at least, especially with the rising energy prices. Then there is a discussion to be had about the content that we need to provide covering that area a bit more, because the reason I say that, when you were at the weekend or over the Easter and you were talking to people barbecues or whatever you were doing, I guarantee that nearly every conversation you had at some point pivoted towards the cost of living. Maybe they're moaning about how much cinema tickets cost or energy bills were, food, for example. And because that is the core of what most people are worried about at the moment, we are now looking at that and we're deciding about what we're going to do to help people with that cost of living crisis. So that's one idea. But if you've got ideas, send them in and then we'll look at them. And who knows, you could inspire the next show or idea at Money to the Masses.
Yeah, so send an email to damien@moneytothemasses.com or me, Andy, at moneytothemasses.com. And there's nothing that's off the table there. So feel free to send your ideas through.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you what's on the podcast this week. An investment piece I'm going to focus on to start with. Now, 2022 has been a difficult year for investors and diversification in particular. And if you look at your portfolios out there, bonds have been hammered this year, almost relentlessly. And so there's a question mark over the conventional wisdom of a bond equity portfolio. So one that just diversifies into those two. It's the most popular form of diversification out there. Typically 60% equities, 40% bonds is popular. But I've had questions from people asking, okay, so bonds are taking a hammering. They want to obviously hold something like bonds as a low risk part of their portfolio. So are index linked bonds, and in particular index linked gilts, the solution? And I'm going to explore that, because you're going to be surprised at the answer, actually. The other piece we're going to do on the podcast, it was Earth Day on Friday. So in response to that, at Money to the Masses, we do quite a bit of stuff that relates to tackling climate change and initiatives that we've launched in recent months. And so we're going to share that with you. So I'm going to duck off the podcast at that point, because Justin, who's been on the podcast before, my twin, who sounds just like me, so it's too confusing if we're both on the podcast at the same time. Justin's going to come on and explain not only what we're doing, but how easy it is for people to get involved in investing directly to help the environment, either personally or through their businesses like we are. So that includes things like offsetting the climate impact that your business might have in terms of resources it uses, or your employees as well. Now, the reason this is important, because in the last few months, there has been a definite shift away in terms of sympathy from the public towards things that are related to trying to combat climate change. And by that, I mean, if you look at food, for example, people who would buy things that are much more sustainable in the way they're produced. Lots of these things are more expensive. So the cost of living crisis is putting a squeeze on those things. So people are therefore having to make choices which aren't necessarily as green as the ones they would like to make. Equally, I talked about green energy the other week. There are issues around certain tariffs that are more expensive. So some people will end up choosing tariffs, for example, that are cheaper because they can afford them, but they will be less green. And of course, ethical investing. Ethical investing has struggled this year because all the things that have done well are all the things that are bad for the environment, particularly things like oil, gas, weapons manufacturers, all those sorts of things. I did a podcast recently on it. Those are the things that have outperformed, and things that are ethically screened have sometimes lagged. So you can see there's a shift away. Some people may be chasing performance, shifting away from investing or helping the environment. But what Justin is going to talk about is something that enables people as companies to be able to directly have an impact, or as individuals from as little as about £5 a month. And finally, Andy is going to do a piece on scams.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly cover off a scam that's been doing the rounds of late in relation to the Council Tax Rebate. Now, you may have heard about that. It's the rebate that Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced for people who fall into council tax bands A to D will be getting rebates from April this year. I'm going to just talk about what to be careful of so that you're not taken advantage of by fraudsters. So Damien, we're going to start with the investing piece and looking at bonds and inflation-linked bonds, and there's some surprising stuff in there.
Yeah, so in 2022, we've seen the traditional bond equity portfolio, which is what most people will invest in, particularly if you go and buy something like the Vanguard Life Strategy funds, which are incredibly popular. They will invest in part in equities, and it may be a diversified mix of those from around the world, and also bonds. Now, I've run the numbers for year-to-date returns, so that's from January the 1st, 2022, up until I make this podcast at the back end of April 2022. And the Life Strategy Fund that's got a 20% exposure to equities, so it's 80% bonds, effectively 20% equities, is down almost 8% year to date. The 40% version, so 40% equities, is down nearly 7%. If you were in the 60% equity version, so that means the other 40 is broadly in global bonds of some kind, you were down 5.67%. And the 80% equity exposure Life Strategy Fund from Vanguard is down 4.5%. And the version of the Life Strategy Fund that is 100% equities is down 3.36%. Now that might surprise people because we've had equity market weakness. We know that, and we've had the market rebound somewhat. But actually, the greater your exposure to bonds, the worse your portfolio would have done. Now, into the beginning of March, the opposite was true. So those numbers that I said there, they'd have been basically flipped on their head. So the 100% equity fund would have been down nearly 10% by mid-March when we had the sell-off after the war in Ukraine started. But then we had a rebound in equity markets that rallied and has started to falter a bit again. Now, we don't know where that's going to end up. But at the same time, we had bond markets just continually grind lower. And that's because of rising inflation and the fear that central banks will tighten monetary policy, meaning they'll raise interest rates, which obviously therefore makes bonds less attractive. So I'm probably going to be looking at the idea that is the bond equity portfolio now dead? Does it no longer work for 80/20 investor members in the near future? Because it raises some interesting questions. And the reason why we've had the issue this year is because, generally speaking, bonds and equities have moved in the same direction. So when equities have fallen, so have bonds, because of this almost unusual environment, this perfect storm that we're in that I've just described. And of course, that was all against a backdrop of the war in Ukraine as well. Typically, as in history, bonds and equities do tend to move in opposite directions. So when one falls, the other rises, and they provide that diversification of portfolios. And so they've been loved by people who have made portfolios in the industry over the last sort of 10, 20 years. But right now, bonds are coming under pressure because of the expectation that central banks will raise interest rates. And just remember that bonds, fixed income, they do tend to provide you a fixed coupon over time, a fixed interest payment, with the principal at the end given back to you because essentially a loan. If interest rates are flying in the economy, they're rising, it makes bonds less attractive because the return, the interest payments are typically fixed.
And so the real value of that is being eroded, right?
Yeah, and so therefore people would look elsewhere, and they would tend to look at things like equities because it could be certain companies could be able to pass on the increases in costs to their consumers, and therefore they may be able to outperform in this kind of environment. Now, those numbers I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to get into the diversification and other things you can hold. We've talked about bits of that before, and I might come on and talk about it next week in more detail. For example, my portfolio that I run on 80/20 Investor, the 50k one, is only down just over 1% year to date. So that's obviously good. And it's because I've not got a equity bond only portfolio. I have other assets in there which are doing particularly well. And I'll give you a hint for those who don't have an 80/20 Investor. One of those assets is gold, and that's actually been performing very well in 2022. Now, the question I got was, okay, so bonds are getting hammered in this high inflation environment. Should we be buying index-linked gilts? So index-linked bonds or gilts that I'm going to focus on, they work slightly differently to a traditional gilt. Now, a gilt is a loan to the UK government effectively. So what happens is you imagine that you are loaning the government a sum of money, which they will pay back at an agreed point in the future, let's just say 10 years, and then you get a income, an interest payment, it's called a coupon, at a stated time throughout that at a stated rate. So it could be a certain percentage every year. That's how they work. And of course, people trade them. They don't keep that loan going. They trade gilts. But what most people do is they will buy a gilt fund. So if they want exposure to gilts, they'll buy a gilt fund that's run by a manager that has exposure to lots and lots of different gilts with different maturity dates, and therefore they aren't directly exposed to one issue of gilts. They're exposed to a range of them. Now, leading on from that, there are versions called index-linked gilts. And what that means is there's an element of inflation protection attached to them. So with an index-linked gilt, normally you get semi-annual cash flows from them, but they're linked to CPI. So that CPI is the official, or one official measure of inflation. So that's a consumer prices index. The point is that the coupon, so the interest payment that you get each year, will be adjusted for inflation since the bond was issued, and the principal, so the amount that you get back at the end if you were to hold it to maturity, that's increased in line with inflation as well. So in theory, what you've got there is a gilt that's got inflation protection baked in. Now that sounds the perfect solution for an environment that we're in where we've got bonds doing badly because of inflation. Why wouldn't you go and buy inflation protected gilts, which are called index linked gilts, and put those in your portfolio instead? Now, what might surprise people is if I tell you what the year-to-date returns are on different types of bonds. So these are the average numbers for bonds from different sectors. So it's the average return for the year-to-date. So from the start of 2022 to the end of April 2022. Now, global bonds funds, on average, they're funds that invest in bonds from around the world, typically America, are down 4.82%. Sterling high yield, so these high yield bonds, again, it can vary where they are, often in the UK, but it can be sometimes elsewhere. They are down 5%. And high yield bonds, just as a bit of a lesson, often have a strong link to equities in terms of their performance. So when equities do badly, high yield bonds tend to underperform other types of bonds. Now, strategic bond funds have a bit of a mixture. They're meant to be like go anywhere type of bonds, but they kind of are, again, quasi high yield bonds, and they are down just over 5%. Bog standard corporate bonds, so they are basically bonds that are issued by companies. Those ones that are in the UK, on average, they're down about 6.7% year to date. Now, global emerging market bonds are down 8.23%. Now we get to UK gilts. They're down 9.33%, but if you bought index linked gilts, on average, your fund would be down 9.66% in just over 3 months, so nearly 4 months. Now, you'd be surprised at that because you'd be sitting there thinking, this is an inflationary environment. Why wouldn't they be outperforming all the others? Now, of course, global bonds got a bit of a currency kicker because the pound has tumbled, but I want to explain why index-linked gilts aren't working in this environment, and they're unlikely to in this environment. Now, it's because despite the fact that they have this inflation part baked into the coupon and the principal, the coupon represents a very small amount of the total return on an index-linked bond. And that's because the coupon on those tend to be really low. They're much lower than what you'd get on a conventional gilt, one that isn't index linked. So even though that's index linked, what that contributes to your total return is quite minuscule. To give you an example, the coupon often on an index linked gilt is about 0.125%. So if you're going to have that index linked, you can see that's a tiny effective interest rate. Even if you inflation protect it, then whoopee-doo. Now, by comparison, if you look at something like a normal gilt, then the interest rate, the coupon rate on that, is going to be much higher for an equivalent time span, so the same term. And it could be, for example, if we're comparing them for about 10 years or so, a 10-year gilt could be going towards perhaps 2%.
Wow.
So it's more attractive. It's not blowing the lights out, but it's definitely more attractive.
I totally get that now, because by comparison, the return that the inflation protection gives you is just that minuscule 0.15%, but 2% on the standard bonds or gilts is many times better in terms of
and that's the thing. It's not necessarily a huge sum of money you're talking about. These are still low interest rates. But what you've highlighted is that one of the key things that impacts the price of a gilt, because the price of the gilt will go up and down depending on the demand for that particular type of index-linked gilt, that is dictated partly by the relationship between conventional gilts and what they call linkers, which are index-linked gilts. And of course, if you're sitting there thinking, right, I want to have this insurance against inflation, this inflation protection. But on the one hand, what investors would do is they'd look there and go, well, what do I want? This insurance, but what I'm actually getting in terms of coupon is low, but I could get now a much better return in the short term looking at those coupons. So what you tend to see is that people can shift, and they will actually, when they're comparing the two, might then go, do you know what? Inflation's picking up rapidly, and more importantly, it's people are worried about Bank of England might increase interest rates. They might just go, look, do you know what? I'm not really worried about the inflation protection. I'm just now worried about what the rate I'm going to get the coupon on it. And they will therefore shift away from linkers to conventional gilts. So that is one dynamic that happens, and that therefore causes a downward pressure on the value of index-linked gilts. So that's why they start to potentially underperform in an environment where you think they shouldn't. And the other thing, when we look at the return from, say, an index-linked gilt, so a linker, is okay, part of it is from the coupon that you get, and like we've already said, that's going to be fairly low in a lot of circumstances, but it's going to be the change in value of the price of that linker. It's going to go up or down, isn't it, if you want to sell it or buy it. So the change in that capital value is going to be the main driver of the returns that you get. Because although I said that it's a loan effectively to the government, if people want safety because that loan is going to be repaid, people are willing to pay more for it. So therefore, the price of that bond effectively goes up, that price of that index-linked gilt. Now, the thing that impacts the price, two things really that have a major impact, are future inflation expectations, but also future expected central bank rate moves. So if they think that interest rates are going to go up, then it starts to really impact the capital value of not just gilts, but particularly index-linked gilts. And that's because it's all to do with what investors think the future expected real yields are going to be. So that's the yield basically taking into account inflation. Now, don't get bogged down by that, but one of the things that you have to learn is that you think gilts, okay, are quite a low risk investment. They're safe. That's what would be the general view of them, because they are going to be repaid by a government. So they are the lowest rung of the bond hierarchy in terms of risk. So they sit there and think, well, the government's going to pay it back. It's unlikely the UK government will go completely bankrupt. But index-linked gilts in particular are more volatile than the conventional gilts. And what that means is they're much more sensitive to interest rate moves. And I want to just quickly explain this before I finish this piece, that there is something that's unique about the index-linked gilt market. Most of the people that hold them, and it's not the biggest market in the world, are pension funds. And so pension funds use them to match future liabilities that they have to pay out pensions. And so when they hold them for the duration. So until they mature, until that principal comes back. That's all built in to match the liabilities they've got in the future. The thing is that the average maturity of one of these in the UK now is 21 years, and that's a long time. And it means that they are much more sensitive to interest rate moves. Now, there's something called duration that I've talked about on the podcast before, which is a measure of the sensitivity of the price of a bond to changes in interest rates. Now, all you've got to latch onto is that index-linked gilts have a significant duration risk, which means that they are very sensitive to changes in interest rates. So in an environment like we are now, where we expect interest rates to go up, what it means is that suddenly they are very sensitive and their price will fall. And because it starts to impact the yield, the way bonds work, when the yield increases, the bond price falls. It's just the way they work. And when the real yield on a linker increases by 1%, it means that the capital value will fall 20% on average. And that's using the FTSE Actuaries UK Index linked gilt all stock index as a measure. But all you've got to realize is that you can get a very small increase in expectations and it can have a very severe fall in the capital value. So that's why, when I go back to the numbers I mentioned earlier, that's why index linked gilts are down nearly 10% year to date. So what this all means, we take it in the round, index linked gilts work if you hold them to maturity. The interest rate risk is reduced because you're buying something that you know what you're going to get, and it matches and works for pension funds. It means that they're not great for retail investors who will probably hold them for short periods of time, or will hold funds that invest in them for short periods of time, because you will get these wild price moves. And so they are very volatile. They're not as low risk as you would think a gilt would naturally be. In fact, I would class them as quite high risk investments because of this volatility that occurs. So if anybody learns from this podcast, is that don't automatically assume, which is what most people will do, that I'm going to go for an index linked gilt fund because it's a gilt, it's got inflation protection, and it's going to be safe. All of those things effectively aren't true. It's going to be very volatile. It doesn't give you protection, in essence, in an environment where you're going to get high inflation because interest rates are going to go up. It's that expectation of interest rates that's the killer. And so what you would need to do is think about diversifying perhaps elsewhere, which comes back to my point about diversifying perhaps into other assets, not just into bonds. And that can be targeted absolute return funds as well. So there you go, Andy. That explains to people how index-linked gilt funds work, because it is a topic that's not very well understood. Oh, and as ever, there's one final thought on this. In America, there are things called TIPS, which are the equivalent of the linkers in the UK, and they have a much lower maturity on average. So there are people who have used those in their portfolios instead, particularly fund managers, to try and give some inflation protection to the bond part of their portfolio. So that's really just a side note to broaden people's understanding.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then. And we're going to bring Justin onto the podcast to talk about something that Money to the Masses has been doing, but actually that other businesses and individuals can do to help the world.
It's great to be on the show again. And this week, as it's Earth Week and it was Earth Day on Friday, just gone, Damien and Andy thought that it might be quite a good idea and quite timely for me to come on the show and just talk a little bit more about what we've been doing at Money to the Masses regarding our environmental credentials and some of the initiatives that we've been looking at over the last couple of months. So what really kicked this off was last year we've been doing a lot of work, and I have, with our developers behind the scenes, looking at how Money to the Masses website works, some of the things, the technology that we use, the kind of digital infrastructure really. And one of the things that I've been wanting to do, and all of us really, I think, in society, we've been very much aware of, that we can, as a business, do things better. We're not terrible, but there's certainly ways that we can be more environmentally aware and be climate positive, to be honest. So in the last year, we've made a lot of changes to the way the site is coded, sort of the hosting of it, the technology behind it, and all part of that. In the background, we were looking at, can we make Money to the Masses more environmentally friendly? Can we make it have a positive impact on the environment? And even some of the bigger questions, what's its carbon footprint? Can we make it carbon neutral? Can we look at making it net zero? All those kind of questions I've been looking at over the last 12 months. And we've done a lot of work. And that's kind of led us to where we got to at the beginning of 2022, where we put into place some initiatives that I'm going to quickly talk about on the podcast. And also just to tell people about how they can do things for their own business and their own personal lives. And just to give them some kind of maybe some food for thought. And there's some really cool stuff out there, actually. reality once you start to look into it. So when doing all of this work, one of the things that I think you'll have seen a lot with Earth Day, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of phrases, and two phrases I want to cover off just to help make sense of some of the stuff I'm going to say. One is carbon neutral and one is net zero.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because you mentioned it earlier, and I must admit those two phrases are interchangeable in my mind and they kind of mean the same thing, but I take it they don't.
No, and they don't. And in my research over the last year and the work that I've been doing, it started to become more apparent how different these two things are. So you'll see a lot of companies say and claim these things, but actually when you dig down into the detail of them, they are very, very different. They have different processes involved and very different costs. So carbon neutral really means purchasing carbon reduction credits that are equivalent to the emissions that you as a person, your lifestyle or your business emits. And actually, you don't really need to reduce your emissions to do that. So there was a case with the golf.
Oh, Rory McIlroy.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So Rory McIlroy, he came into some criticism where he said that he does a lot of flights around the world playing golf, but he said he invested heavily into trying to offset his footprint.
I think the main criticism for him was he takes private flights, which obviously in terms of aviation is not necessarily environmentally friendly. And he came out against that and sort of explained the things he was doing, which is obviously a carbon neutral.
Yeah, and it's offsetting. So basically you offset what you're producing by investing in initiatives, etc., that help you reduce the carbon and offset what you're doing. I think in that instance, quite rightly, people could say, does he have to take a private jet? Could he get on other forms of transport or even a commercial flight? As a business and as individuals, there's only so much we can do. There's only so much we can realistically reduce things. And we should all be doing that. And we do that here. We recycle, we do lots of different things and look at the energy that we use. But the reality is we are going to produce carbon. And so to become carbon neutral, there comes a point often where you have to look at maybe some of the potential schemes out there that will help you offset using carbon reduction projects, which reduce the amount of CO2 that's released in the atmosphere. So that really covers direct emissions. So the sort of things that this covers is investment in renewable energies, that kind of thing. It could be looking at other solar and wind projects. And typically these are cheaper than net zero alternatives. And to be honest, when I was looking at some of the stuff we do for Mains to the Masses and personally, these kind of projects are a fantastic starting point because they are things that you can do now. Whereas some of the other, the more grander goals, so Google will talk about net zero, those kinds, they take a lot more investment, but they also take a lot more time to be able to do. Net zero, on the other hand, is fundamentally different. The difference with that is that this is actually about not purchasing carbon reduction credits or investing in projects that will help you offset your carbon emissions. This is really about reducing your emissions in line with the latest climate science and balancing anything that you can't reduce. Because there is a reality, you can't reduce everything. Then you can use carbon removal credits. So what this typically does is you will invest in removal projects that actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the idea being, if you as an individual, as a business, an entity, you produce 200 tons of CO2, you will invest in projects that will take 200 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. All at the same time, trying to actually not produce any CO2 yourself or reduce that. So that is the difference. Other key difference when it comes to planting trees, you see a lot of stuff in the press, a lot of things about planting trees, and planting trees are great because obviously they help with carbon reduction. That's kind of well publicized. But planting new trees is different to investing in mature reforestation. So trees really need to be 10 years or older to be able to start removing CO2 from the atmosphere in any kind of sizable way that will have an impact. So that's the difference. Carbon neutral essentially means that you are making sure you're not contributing any more to the environment and you're offsetting that. Net zero means that you can sit there and say, when you look at it, you've removed what you've put into the atmosphere, and fundamentally your aim is to not put anything in the atmosphere. So after looking at all this and explaining the difference between those terms, I wanted to talk about a little bit about what have we been doing at Mains to the Masses, what are the exciting things that we've been trying to do to make our business be more climate positive. Actually, how can we achieve a carbon neutral? At the moment, we're not at that stage where we can be net zero, but those technologies and those initiatives that are going to be more accessible as time goes on will be something that will help us achieve that. So what have we been doing? The first thing we do at Mains to the Masses is we offset all of our human impact. So we offset the carbon footprint of everybody that works for Money to the Masses, and that's in their work and personal lives. So we invest in projects that help us make sure that we meet that carbon footprint. Other things that we do is we start to look at how we offset our business impact, and we do that by offsetting all the carbon we have emitted either directly or indirectly since Money to the Masses first came into being, which is in 2010. And I'll come on to explain that, because I think there's probably a few things here that some people can take away for their own businesses. And then other thing we've done is we've moved a lot of our infrastructure, as I mentioned at the start, our hosting, using caching services, things like that use more sustainable energy sources, and they are more efficient. There's a thing called power usage effectiveness ratings, which are to do with data centers, etc. And finally, we offset all of the carbon footprint created by anybody that comes to the Money to the Masses website. I don't mean their lives, but the energy that's generated in them interacting with our website. So when you go to a website, the data centers are humming away, the cooling fans are doing their thing, and there's a lot of energy that's being used in those. So we've managed to calculate what that is and offset that. And then the last thing that we've done is in the last year, we've done a lot of work on the coding part of Money to the Masses and what runs the website. And not a lot of people realize that actually one way to reduce the energy usage of websites or programs is to make the code cleaner. What I mean by that is making it more efficient. So over years, legacy systems, they get worse and worse and worse. They're running processes that they might not necessarily need to do. There's all of that computer usage, servers jigging around.
They're taking the long routes, aren't they? And so what we're doing there is creating the shortcuts, the shortest path to the goal.
Yeah, and the website came around 10 years ago. So how things are done there, technology and coding and everything's moved on so much that things are far more efficient. So by making sure our website code is as efficient as possible, it uses significantly less energy per visitor than it would have done 2, 3, 4, 10 years ago. So again, that's something that we've been doing.
And actually that has a double impact as well, because it means the end user will actually get a better experience.
Yeah. Just going back to a couple of those things is, how do we calculate, and how did me and the team calculate what our carbon footprint is? How do we decide what we're going to offset? How do we actually do that? So one of the ways is there's a lot of good tools out there. One thing I would recommend to anyone that's interested in doing this for themselves personally or for their own business is go out and look at Earth Day posts of all the companies and people you like. They might be sharing services that they are using. Go and investigate them and see how they're doing it. But for us, one of the things that's important is, obviously lots of people come to our website. How do you work out how much carbon is produced? To be honest, it's not an exact science. There is some assumptions in there. So there's quite a cool website that's called the Website Carbon Calculator. So websitecarbon.com. Go and have a look at it if you've got a website or you run some kind of digital property. And what it does is, if you put your website URL in, it runs off and beavers in the background, and it has a look at some of the page load, how long it takes for your page to load, the kind of the code that's on there. It looks at things like if it can tell that you're using sustainable energy at your data center. Are you using any things like caching, which make things appear quicker and not have to do so many server calculations? It does all that, and it comes up with a figure. It tells you how you compare to other websites out there. At the moment, with Money to the Masses, the last time I looked, we were cleaner than 75% of internet pages out there, which is something that I was quite proud of. But it gives you an assumption. It tells you how many grams of CO2 each page view generates. So if you take that, you can then work out what your website, which is what we did, and multiply it up by that figure. And you can come up with effectively the amount of carbon that visitors to your website produce by them actually being on there through the systems of your server, etc. It's quite a neat little tool, and it helped me in our calculations. And another tool that I would say, and I'm going to come on to it in more detail, is there are services out there that will help you offset your carbon, but they'll also help tell you a little bit more about what the typical carbon footprint is of someone. Website that I'm going to come on to called ecology.com. They've got some great tools on there. You can have a look. It gives you an assumption on the typical type of person you are and how much you or your employees, the amount of carbon they're likely to produce and what you need to do to offset that. So what have we done so far and how have we done that? So far this year, since we kicked off this initiative, we've planted 434 new trees and we've offset 89 tons of CO2. So how have we done that? We've done that by using a service called ecology.com. And Ecology is an environmental organisation, and their goal is to help facilitate carbon offset projects and the planting of trees around the world. Go and have a look at their website. I really would say, if it's something that's interesting you for yourself or for your business. It's a really good looking website and it's really easy to use. And their mission is to reduce 50% of global CO2 emissions by 2040. Quite a big goal, quite audacious, but the low cost of doing this per person at £5, they believe that there should be enough people that can afford that to be able to help them meet that goal.
And that's £5 a month, right?
£5 a month, yeah.
Okay.
And so if you go on their website as a person, you can go on there and you sign up, do your £5 a month, and they will take that money. And this is how it works. They take that money and they invest it in tree planting initiatives all around the world. They invest it into carbon offsetting projects. It could be solar farms, it could be wind farms, all sorts of great stuff on there. But the best bit about it is, and this is what I ask all of you to go and do, go to their website and you can check out what Money to the Masses have done. Go to ecology.com/money to the masses.
And so just to confirm, that's ecology spelled ECOLOGI.com/money to the masses. Slightly different spelling of the word ecology.
If you go to that page, you can see our forest that we are planting. You can see the 434 trees represented each by little icons, and you click on them and it will tell you where they are. They'll tell you how many trees we planted, the location of them, what those projects are doing. It will tell you about the solar projects that money's been invested in. It will tell you about even things like transport projects that they've invested in to help reduce the carbon footprint of systems in India, for example. It's really, really great. It's tangible, and as an organisation, they have a lot of transparency. They show you receipts for the trees that are planted. They give you certificates about your carbon offsetting.
And each tree actually has an actual number and a reference with a receipt. It's all good.
Yeah. So that's what I liked about it. When I looked at lots of solutions, there is evidence of the tree that you have planted in whichever country it shows it is, and it has a number, and it definitely says, right, this is the trees, this is what you've done. And so for somebody that wants to try and help the environment, not just by putting money into a scheme, they want to see what it's doing.
Yeah.
That's what's great about it. And at an individual level, it does the same. And what is really exciting is you can share what you're doing. You can show it to people. You can show it for us, to our teams. We can share it with you. But even more exciting and interesting is if you go on to ecology.com/money to the masses and you look at our little forest there and what we've funded. If you're something you're interested in doing for yourself, your family, there's a join button. If you click on that, then they will plant 30 extra trees on your behalf and 30 extra trees on our behalf. And that's 63 trees. That can only be a good thing. And so this community aspect can really help that grow. So in all, I think that's a great little service. I think something for you to definitely look at if you're interested in what is a cost-effective way to try and become more environmentally positive, even as an individual, as a company. And hopefully this year we're looking to plant 1,400 trees and offset about 95 tonnes of carbon, all whilst kind of operating Money to the Masses.
I think that's a really interesting piece. And obviously, we brought it to the podcast today because it tied in very nicely with Earth Day coming up on Friday. But it's something that Money to the Masses has been passionate about and been doing in the background for quite a few months. Now, there might be listeners that are listening to this podcast, looking at the cost of living, looking at things rising, petrol and everything else, and thinking, why are you bringing this to the podcast now? We haven't got this kind of money. Look, we understand it's a difficult time, but these kind of projects, people assume they're really expensive and they can't make a difference. And what can you do? Well, this is a tangible way that you can get involved cost effectively.
Yeah, and I think as well, where we got to with this last year is looking at what we do. And we are a very socially responsible company. Our whole ethos is about helping people for free. That's what we do every minute of the day. But there's also things about, can we be better for the environment? And I think us as a business, we wanted to be more mindful and start asking those questions about, are we doing enough? The answer was, we could have done a lot more. The answer still is, we can do better. We can become net zero at some point. But I think it's a start. And I think if it's something that you're looking for in your own lives, your family lives, if you own a company, you're looking to maybe just do something that is just beyond more than reducing your resources that you use and recycling, which a lot of us have kind of maxed that out, then just check it out.
It's the next logical step. Brilliant. Thanks ever so much for coming on, Justin. And again, just to confirm, the spelling of ecology is slightly different to what you would expect. So it's ECOLOGI.com/money to the masses. Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. Thanks for that, Justin. Damien, let's bring you back in so there's no confusion. That was Justin. This is Damien. You're back, aren't you?
I am back. I'm back in the room. I never really went anywhere. I just didn't talk.
And I'm going to be covering off the council rebate scam that's hit the news, and lots of councils have been posting primarily on social media, alerting people to the latest cold calling scam. So let's just talk about what it is in relation to. People may know already that there was an announcement by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, in response to the increase to the energy price cap. There were a certain few measures that were put in place, and one of them was that anybody who falls within council tax bands A to D would get a rebate of £150 on their council tax. Now, what has made it slightly difficult for customers is that the rules are slightly different depending on how you pay your council tax. So in the main, if you pay your council tax by direct debit, really you don't have to do anything. Your local council will deposit the money into your bank account. That's how it's going to work. When it happens is up for debate because different councils have different teams working on it, and it can be any time from now, April we currently stand at, right through to September. But the message is they are dealing with it and it's going to happen sometime soon. But where there is a slight break in this system, and what makes it difficult for councils, is there are a number of people out there who don't pay their council tax by direct debit. And it's a job for the councils to get in contact with these people and take their bank details in some way in order to reimburse them the £150 that they are rightly due. And so unscrupulous fraudsters are actually taking advantage of this by contacting people, cold calling people, just chancing their arm and telling people that they're due a council tax rebate and to give them bank details, effectively purporting to be from the councils and taking bank details over the phone. Once they've got those bank details, they can then use those details to take money fraudulently from their account. So it's really, this piece is all about highlighting that this is happening and what people can do about it. So the message is councils will not call you and ask for your bank details. That's the message of the podcast. It will never happen. We've looked online and we've checked council details and we've checked other sort of consumer websites, including Which, and they've all confirmed that councils will not do this. What they will be doing is they'll be contacting their customers. And again, because there's so many different councils and different ways that they do it, it will either be by letter or by email. Some may phone to say that there is a system in place, and then from there you will then be maybe led to an online process. So just be vigilant. Don't give your details over the phone. You will be contacted. So if you are one of these people that doesn't pay council tax by direct debit and you're expecting a rebate, you will likely be contacted by letter or by email. If you do get a call from the council, it could well be genuine, but the best thing to do is to very politely terminate that call and make contact with your council yourself, either in response to the letter or email that you have received. If you haven't received that, then go and find your council details, their telephone number, through searching for them online and make contact with them yourself. And the likelihood is you'll be passed on to a team who will let you know that there's an online form you need to fill in, or you can take matters from there by being proactive.
And on that, Andy, I want to add something about council tax, completely separate to this. This is to anybody who pays council tax, which is basically everyone, all intents and purposes. Something I did the other day, that council tax is normally charged over a 10-month period. So if you pay by direct debit, then often they will take that over 10 months, and the last 2 months of any year, there will be no money taken from your account. It's just the way it's often done. And if it's set up that way, then you get to like February, March time, and then no council tax is taken. But you can ask them to spread the cost equally over 12 months rather than doing it in that fashion of 10 and then 2 without any money taken. And what that does, your bill is obviously identical, but it lowers the monthly amount that you've got to have go out of your account. And the reason I mention this is because I did it recently, because by doing so, it brought down my monthly budgeting for my council tax by about £30. And instead what I did is I took that £30 and I upped my direct debits voluntarily on my energy bills by that amount. So my overall budget for bills is actually identical, but what I've done is just rejigged it so that I am now building up some credit on my energy bills over the summer months for when we are going to get these price hikes in October. So it isn't going to be so much of a shock. Of course, you could argue that if you had paid the council tax over 10 months, that when you had month 11 and month 12 off, you could have taken that money aside and done something with it. But reality is that doesn't actually happen. If you're anything like me, it kind of gets lost in the wash anyway. So if you're strict budgeting like we all are these days, I found that useful. It means that I'm budgeting a set amount each month that's slightly lower, but it means I'm actually redirecting it towards my energy bill. So it's just about rejigging your finances finances slightly, you may find that helpful. So that is it this week anyway, Andy. I think we're done. We did quite a lot on the podcast this week. As ever, you can get in contact via email, damien@moneytothemasses.com. Please leave a review for the podcast on the site to tell us how much you love it, because then it will not only help us in terms of the charts, but it will make us happy and motivated to make even more shows and potentially send you a mug in the post. And of course, as Justin said, please do look at the ecology.com/money to the masses link. And if you sign up via that, then you could actually increase our and your contribution to tackling climate change by planting even more trees. So that is it then for this week, Andy. I suppose all that's left is to say until next time.
Until next time.